When I moved into the sleepy, over-landscaped neighborhood of Maple Hollow Estates, all I wanted was a little peace, privacy, and the freedom to enjoy my backyard in solitude. So I did what any reasonable new homeowner would do. I built a beautiful, 6-foot wooden privacy fence, stained in a warm cedar tone, following every local city ordinance to the inch, setting it in concrete, and even hiring a licensed contractor to ensure it was up to code, which it was. Every nail, board, and measurement. But what I didn't anticipate was the wrath of the Homeowners Association, a collection of self-appointed neighborhood overlords, who apparently spent their days driving around in golf carts measuring things they didn't like with flimsy tape measures and an overinflated sense of authority. And within a week of completing my fence, I received a thick, humorless envelope in the mail with bold letters. Notice of violation: fence height exceeds HOA maximum guideline, along with a $500 fine and a demand to remove or reduce the structure within 14 days, or face escalating penalties. And I couldn't believe it. My fence, which barely peeked over the shrubs lining my yard, was being treated like a national security threat, all because it stood 6 inches above their arbitrary 5.5-foot height limit, which, by the way, wasn't in any of the documents I signed when I bought the house. Because like many HOAs, they updated rules during quarterly meetings no one knew about, and buried them in 70-page PDFs emailed at 10 p.m. And of course, the violation was signed by none other than HOA compliance chairwoman Judith Freeman, a retired librarian, turned petty tyrant who once fined a neighbor for leaving their trash, been visible for exactly 16 minutes past pickup. And while most people would have panicked or caved, I smiled. Because what Judith and her little band of beige-clad enforcers didn't know was that I wasn't just any homeowner. I was an architect and urban planner with a degree in historical structures and a side passion for medieval design. And more importantly, I had time, resources, and a very spiteful creative streak. So instead of tearing down my fence, I did something better. I complied, technically, by removing the offending panels. But I also submitted a new application for an artistic and historic landscaping enclosure, a clause buried deep in the HOA guidelines that permitted non-traditional structures exempt from standard fence regulations, as long as they were decorative in nature and not intended solely for privacy or security. And with that loophole as my weapon, I rolled up my sleeves and began designing a new structure, not a fence, but a perimeter enclosure inspired by Norman-era castles, complete with simulated stone facing, mock bat, and decorative towers no taller than 8 feet, which, according to the HOA's own handbook, qualified as ornamental features and not permanent walls. And over the next month, I hired masons, artists, and friends from my college architecture circle to help me build a scaled-down medieval castle facade around my backyard, using cast concrete faux stones, recycled wood, and sculpted plaster to create a structure that looked ancient but was entirely compliant. And the moment the turrets began to rise, the HOA lost their collective minds, sending daily letters, emails, and even showing up at my door to discuss concerns. And I simply pointed to the clause in their handbook and the approved permit from the city, which I had framed on my entryway wall like a certificate of victory. And when Judith screamed that I was mocking the spirit of the rules, I just replied, I'm honoring them, decoratively. And the more they pushed, the more I doubled down, adding stained glass faux windows made from acrylic ivy planters to the outer walls, and even a working drawbridge-style garden gate completely for show, of course. But, oh so satisfying. And soon, people began to notice, not just in Maple Hollow but across the city, with cars slowing down to take photos, kids walking by pointing excitedly, and even a few tourists who started tagging #castle in the suburbs on social media. And I embraced it fully, adding a wooden sign near the walkway that said Fort Freedom, and hosting a backyard barbecue for neighbors who'd also grown tired of the HOA's nonsense. And they came in droves, bringing beer, stories, and laughter, because as it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had suffered under Judith's reign of paperwork and fines. There were dozens of them, all fed up, all inspired by my rebellion. And together we started combing through the bylaws, finding loopholes, inconsistencies, and laughably vague language that gave us just enough room to fight back. And soon, the neighborhood began changing, not with anger, but with creativity. One man turned his birdhouse into a Roman temple, a woman redesigned her garage door to look like a bookstore facade, and someone even repainted their shutters to look like medieval shields. All decorative, all within the rules, and all driving Judith insane. And while she attempted to halt it all by calling for an emergency board vote to rewrite the guidelines, I had already beaten her to the punch by running for an open seat on the board with overwhelming support, and one which gave me access to meeting minutes, financial records, and a voice at the table, where I discovered even more abuse used for board member perks, vendor contracts awarded to relatives, and zero transparency with how dues were spent. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about a fence or even a castle. It was about dismantling the HOA's stranglehold on creativity, expression, and fairness. And as I sat on the newly constructed stone bench in my backyard one evening, with torches flickering decorative LED. Of course, and Jasper, the neighbor's golden retriever, lying beside me like a knight's companion. I realized the real battle had just begun, not with stone and mortar, but with policy, power, and principle, and I was ready to see it through, turret by turret, line by law, until the entire kingdom was free. The second chapter of what the local paper eventually dubbed the castle conflict began not with a bang, but with a gavel, a real one, used in a makeshift HOA board meeting that Judith Freeman called in a last-ditch effort to stop what she now referred to as the architectural anarchy spreading through our once pristine neighborhood. A meeting that was supposed to be private, attended only by board members and a few select residents, but due to my recent appointment to the board, I exercised my right to notify the community of any significant procedural revision, which led to more than 70 people cramming into the HOA's stuffy community center, standing shoulder to shoulder, half of them holding signs like "Let us build" and "Stop the Stone Witch Trials," and Judith, visibly rattled but stubborn as ever, opened with a slideshow presentation titled "Preserving the Suburban Aesthetic," filled with blurry photos of fences, flowers, and a particularly unflattering zoom in of my stone turret taken from what must have been her upstairs bathroom, and her voice shook as she insisted that the HOA was under siege by a coordinated campaign of decorative aggression, and I nearly laughed aloud until I realized she meant it. Judith truly believed that the rise of artistic expression in Maple Hollow was a threat to the very foundation of suburban life. And that's when I stood, calmly, and addressed the crowd, beginning not with mockery or argument, but with a simple reminder. This neighborhood isn't a museum, it's a community, and communities grow when people feel safe, respected, and free to be themselves. And as I spoke, I pulled up pages from the HOA's own charter on the projector, highlighting every clause that protected homeowner creativity, decorative displays, and structures of historical inspiration. And then I presented the most damaging evidence yet, a detailed accounting of HOA spending that revealed nearly $60,000 over the last 2 years had been used on administrative travel, legal retainers for disputes the board had started, and bizarre expenses like executive landscaping review and community uniform flower audits, none of which were approved by vote, all signed off by Judith or her inner circle. And the room erupted, not in applause, but in outrage, with residents demanding resignations, audits, and reform. And Judith, cornered, declared that she would resign once this madness was under control, but it was too late, because within hours of the meeting, a special petition circulated to hold a recall election, and within 3 days we had the required signatures, and within 2 weeks, Maple Hollow voted in an entirely new board, one focused on transparency, fairness, and yes, creativity. And while Judith vanished from neighborhood view, her house going up for sale quietly, the rest of us got to work rewriting the rules, clause by clause, removing vague language, eliminating fine first policies, and most importantly, inserting a new section called the Creative Liberty Clause, which protected artistic, cultural, and historical installations as long as they posed no safety risk. And with that, a new era dawned in Maple Hollow, one where homeowners embraced their yards like blank canvases. One family turned their front lawn into a miniature Zen garden. Another installed a working windmill. Someone else painted a mural of the town's history along their retaining wall. And my own backyard castle became the heart of it all, hosting community game nights, movie screenings projected against faux stone walls, and even a Halloween event called The Siege, where kids dressed up as knights and dragons to navigate a backyard maze I built from removable foam battle fence. And it became more than a home, it became a landmark, a symbol of what happens when one person says no to unjust rules and yes to something bigger, something braver. And the local paper ran a follow-up story titled "The Man Who Fought the HOA with Stone and Law," which made me laugh, not because it was inaccurate, but because it barely scratched the surface of what really changed the culture. The neighbors, the shared sense that we didn't have to live under fear of petty fines or stylistic tyranny, that a community could actually reflect its people, not just enforce monotony. And in the end, the best part wasn't the castle itself, or even the legal victory. It was seeing kids grow up in a neighborhood where imagination was encouraged, where families felt ownership over their space, and where nobody had to ask permission to be themselves. And as I stood on my balconies, I added a faux balcony to the turret overlooking a street once governed by pettiness, but now blooming with color, charm, and personality. Jasper barked happily at a butterfly floating by, and I raised my coffee mug like a goblet, saluting the neighbors as they passed, knowing that, though it began with a fence, what we really built here was something far stronger, a kingdom of community, carved not from stone, but from freedom.